We've seen a couple of examples of how punctuation matters. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the comma, which is a very useful little punctuation device, and it seems to be modest and seems to not matter that much. We could just willy-nilly sprinkle commas around our sentences, but that's not true. There's a story from a play by Christopher Marlowe, who's a contemporary of Shakespeare, accounted to be a great playwright in his own right. And in it, in this play, he's writing about the English Civil Wars, the civil wars that racked England back in the day, back in the medieval era. And a general who was fighting for the rebel leader, the leader who wanted to be king, captured the actual king, and he didn't know what to do, or he knew what he could do, but he didn't want the responsibility on his own hands. What should he do? Should he take the king prisoner? Should he put him in jail? Should he imprison him? Should he kill him? This was a weighty, very important decision, and he wanted someone higher above him to make that decision. So he sent a message off to his leader and waited anxiously for instructions to come back. And so with that cliffhanger, we'll move on to the next slide. We'll find out what happened. So after a long day of waiting, the message came, and it was in writing, so that was good. He would have unambiguous proof that he had been merely following orders, and he opened it up. He opened up the message, the missive, with trembling hands, and there he saw the message. And he probably said a few bad words in medieval English because the message wasn't so unambiguous, you see, because it said, "Fear not to kill the king." But what does that mean? It is missing commas, all important commas, that would change the meaning of the phrase, depending on how you looked at it. Did it mean, fear not to kill the king? That is, don't be afraid to kill the king. Or did it mean fear not to kill the king? That is, you had better be afraid. You had better not kill the king. Well, he knew what he was being ordered to do, but he knew that no matter what he did, he would be held to account and he would be held responsible. And all because of a comma that was or was not there. Now, I hope your life never hangs on such a slender thread as a comma. But as we can see, commas do matter. Commas change meaning. And in the last lecture, I talked about the phrase, "woman without her man is nothing." What is that? Is that woman without her man is nothing? Or is it woman without her man is nothing? Do you see? So it changes meaning. And we have a couple real life examples over here. I'm pointing in the wrong direction. Okay. This actually appeared on a magazine cover. Rachel Ray finds inspiration in cooking her family and her dog. I don't want to go over to her house for dinner. Okay. And then this real life sign that actually appeared. "Hunters, please use caution when hunting pedestrians using walk trails." Okay, I'm not going to take a walk there. Okay, so punctuation matters and commas matter. So that's the lesson that we're going to take with us as we go into this lesson. We're going to find out when we should use commas and how we can use them so our meaning is unambiguous. Now, why do we need rules for commas? Back in the 3rd grade, Mrs. Grundy told me, put a comma wherever you pause. So that's the rule that I followed for a long time. But that doesn't quite work, and we'll find out why. Why doesn't that rule work? Well, I'll give you an example from my own life. Now, you may have noticed I'm not the smoothest of speakers. Well, when I was a kid, I had a terrible stutter, much worse than I have now. And so when my teacher told me, when Mrs. Grundy told me, put a comma wherever I paused, I did. And so my writing ended up looking like this down here. Okay. For my summification, I went someplace and I went to summer camp. Okay, so I was putting a comma wherever I paused. in the middle of words. Okay, so that rule doesn't quite work. And what about the person who never pauses at all? They just keep on talking without a break or a pause or lacuna like an oncoming freight train. They wouldn't use a comma. They might not even use spaces. So again, that rule doesn't quite work, does it, to put a comma wherever you pause? You see, if we follow the put a comma wherever you pause rule, there's no way to evaluate whether a comma is correctly placed in a sentence or not. There's no way for a reader to evaluate, and there's no way for a teacher to evaluate. You know, all the writer has to say is, well, I paused there. I took a breath there. So, nah, you can't get me, right? The comma is correctly placed because I took a breath there. But that doesn't make sense. In fact, that way madness lies. There are definitive rules for comma placement. Think of the comma as a traffic sign for the sentence. It tells us where to go, where to pause. It groups words into meaning groups, groups of meaning, logical groups. And in the slides that follow, we're going to encounter the definitive comma rules. The first comma rule that we'll encounter is you use a comma when you're joining independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as the boy hit the ball and he ran to first base. The ball went deep into left field, but he was thrown out at first. Okay, so there we have two independent clauses. Remember, an independent clause is a clause that could stand as a sentence by itself. And they're joined by a coordinating conjunction, which is one of the fanboys. So here, now we're starting to link everything that we've learned together. Okay, so that's number one rule when you're joining independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction. Just a couple more examples of this first rule, the joining of two independent clauses using one of the fanboys, for and nor, but or yet or so. The boys wanted to stay up till midnight, but they grew tired and fell asleep. I thought I had the biggest bag of candy, yet Opal proved me wrong. Okay, so here we see a couple of the comma uses, well, the one instance of the comma use in a couple of different examples. The second rule is that we use a comma to set off an introductory element. That is a word, a phrase, or a clause that precedes the main part of the sentence, that precedes the independent clause. That's the main part of the sentence. And we have a couple of examples over here. However, it was still cold. You see that however sets off the main part of the sentence, the independent clause, it was still cold. A phrase can be seen in the next example. In the fall, comma, we enjoy watching football. So that in the fall is set off with a comma. Okay, so that's another example. And the third example, when the rain stopped. You see, so that's a clause. That's a dependent clause. That's a subordinate clause. And when it begins the sentence, we set it off with a comma before we launch into the main clause, the independent clause. When the rain stopped, we went outside. Now, it's true that sometimes you can hear where we pause there, and very often we do. But the rule, again, is not to put a comma wherever you pause. It's that the pause happens to follow the comma. You see, so that's how that works. Okay, so to set off introductory elements, you use a comma. I have a couple other examples over here just to illustrate the point of using the comma to set off the introductory element. And one is, after the rain started coming down, the umpire called the ball game. Or, another example, because it was such a miserable day, we decided against going to the beach. Okay, so those are a couple examples of whole clauses, whole dependent clauses, whole subordinate clauses preceding the independent clause. The next comma rule has to do with unnecessary elements within a sentence. This refers to elements that are grammatically unnecessary, and sometimes even in terms of the central meaning of the sentence, unnecessary. And so we have a couple of examples over here. such as Susan, however, prefers going to the mall. So this might be within the context of my saying something like, I like to go to the beach. Susan, however, likes to go to the mall. So that however is a link to a previous sentence. But in terms of the grammar and the structure of the sentence, it is unnecessary, though it provides important information in a sense. Another example is, again, over here. Mr. Pringle, who is soon to leave the company to start his own business, suggested we undertake the new venture. So that whole clause that's set off in blue, that's highlighted in blue, who is soon to leave the company to start his own business. That's unnecessary. It's unnecessary for the overall structure of the sentence. It's additional information. It's nice to know, but it's not necessary. And then lastly, my Uncle Fred, who lives in Florida, is a mailman. So that living in Florida is unnecessary information, is accounted to be unnecessary information. And it's not necessary to identify which uncle it is that you're talking about because, well, it's Uncle Fred, and you know him. Anyway, okay, so we use the commas to set off unnecessary elements, and these are used, these commas here are used in a parenthetical manner. So, and if you remember our discussion about the parentheses is always used in pairs. So, you have this encapsulating device. And if this element comes within the middle of the sentence, these commas too are used in pairs. You always see these in pairs. These kinds of parenthetical commas always come in pairs, unless, of course, they're at either the beginning of the sentence or the end. Over here, we'll see a couple sentences that give us an idea of a necessary element versus an unnecessary element. And remember, it's the unnecessary element that's set off by commas. And so, as in the previous slide, we use the example sentence, my Uncle Fred, who lives in Florida, is a mailman. So who lives in Florida would be unnecessary, and unnecessary to identify who it is that you're talking about. You're talking about Uncle Fred. So we've already identified the person. But if you say something like, my uncle who lives in Florida is a mailman, you see, then that whole phrase is necessary to identify who it is that you're talking about. I mean, you're not talking about Uncle Bill, Uncle Ron, Uncle Gene, Uncle Patsy. You're talking about the uncle who lives in Florida. Okay, so then that who lives in Florida moves from being an unnecessary element to being a necessary element, and necessary in the sense that it identifies which uncle you're talking about. So this is an important distinction. And so the commas will set off the unnecessary elements, but sometimes that element that can be identical to an unnecessary element becomes necessary, and so you don't use commas to set it off. So, so just remember the example: my uncle who lives in Florida is a mailman, and then my uncle who lives in Florida is one identifier. Okay, versus my Uncle Fred, comma, who lives in Florida, comma, is a mailman. In which case, that clause, who lives in Florida, that relative clause, who lives in Florida, is not necessary, and so it's set off by commas. The next rule that we'll take a look at will be the use of commas in a series of words. Could be words, phrases, clauses. And this follows the pattern of A, comma, B, comma, C, comma, and D. And I'll talk about a little variation on this in the next slide, but for right now, we'll just take a look at that pattern. So apples, comma, oranges, comma, cherries, and pears. And so we see the example over here, and the commas I have highlighted in red, so calls your attention to it. And so you see the comma comes after each item in the series. Another example would be Tom, Fred, Mary, and Joe went to the party together. Okay, so, and each name is followed by a comma. It sets off items in a series. And sometimes you have more complicated arrangements, such as we brought beer and pizza, comma, macaroni and cheese, comma, and ice cream and cake. Okay, so as a weird potluck type of party, but nevertheless, that's what we all brought. Okay, so and the last one takes a look at the uses of actual clauses set off with commas. So the quarterback threw for 300 yards, the crowd cheered wildly, and our home team won the championship. And so we have a comma after each one of those clauses. Quarterback threw for 300 yards, comma, the crowd cheered wildly, comma, and our home team won the championship. Yay! Okay. So, but each one of those clauses in this last sentence is set off by commas as well. It just follows the rule following the pattern of A, comma, B, comma, C, comma, and D. Okay, so that's the rule. Use commas to set off items in a series. The rule that I have just enunciated, the commas in a series up to the last item before the and, is a rule that's in dispute, and not everybody agrees with it. Some style books will not have you use the comma before the and. Okay, so they would say A, comma, B, comma, C, and D. Okay, versus the method that I suggested, A, comma, B, comma, C, comma, and D. There's a reason that I suggest it, because I think it clarifies and it reduces ambiguity. So we can see over here the funny little illustration that I borrowed from the internet, using what's called the Oxford comma. That is the comma before the and. Okay, so we invited the strippers, JFK, and Stalin. Okay, so we invited the strippers, comma, JFK, comma, and Stalin. So that becomes very clear that, as the drawing shows, we invited 4 people, JFK, Stalin, and 2 strippers. Okay, what a fun party. Okay, but without the Oxford comma, it becomes a little ambiguous, and it's very possible to interpret the sentence, we invited the strippers, comma, JFK and Stalin. So JFK and Stalin becomes a modifier, what's called an appositive to strippers. And so we invited the strippers who were JFK and Stalin. So the 2 strippers were JFK, the American president, John F. Kennedy, and Joseph Stalin, the Soviet tyrant. Okay, those are the 2 strippers. I guess in the afterlife they've taken on other occupations. And so that comma, that Oxford comma, helps clarify all the items are in a series versus doing something else, versus modifying what's come before. So I would suggest using the Oxford comma versus confusing your invitation list to the party. Now, along the same idea, using commas to set off items in a series, you also do this with adjectives that are modifying the same noun. So for instance, it was a dark, stormy night. Okay, so dark, comma, stormy night. And so you don't use a comma after the last adjective before the noun. Okay, so you notice there's a comma between dark and stormy. The rule that you can follow here, or a guide that you can follow, is if you could also use an and in the place of the comma. So you would say it was a dark and stormy night, you see. So then if you don't want to use the and, the comma would be appropriate. You could say the night was dark and stormy. He was a tall, bearded man is another example that we have over here. He was tall, comma, bearded. Because you could also say he was tall and bearded. You see, he was a tall and bearded man. The man was tall and bearded. Okay, so if you can use an and in place of the comma in a list of adjectives, then you would use the comma. Okay, if you don't want to be using the and of course, if you have a long list of adjectives, the commas would probably be better. The dog was fierce, big, growling, rabid, and hairy. Okay, you see, so you'd use a comma after each one of those rather than an and in between each one of the adjectives. Okay, so the rule for a series for comma usage holds true for adjectives as well as nouns. The one exception to the above rule is if you are using what's called a phrasal noun. That is a noun that is a single idea, but it's expressed using two words, such as I show in the example here, white rhino. So a white rhino is a single kind of animal. It's not a rhinoceros that happens to be white. It's a white rhino. And so if I wrote a sentence something along the lines of, it was an endangered white rhino, you notice I would not use a comma, because I couldn't say the rhino was endangered and white. You see, because it's a white rhino. The white rhino was endangered, you see. So I wouldn't use a comma in this instance. And likewise, if I said the rare red wine was delicious, again, I wouldn't use a comma because it's not a wine that was rare and red. It was a red wine that was rare. So again, I wouldn't use a comma because the phrasal noun, red wine, is a single idea. Okay, it's in effect, it's one word, even though it looks like it's two words. So just remember that if you have a phrasal noun, the what appears to be the adjective is not included in your series of adjectives. Okay, so the phrasal noun works as a single word by itself. Another rule has to do with the usage of commas with quotes. And so you use a comma to segue into or leave a direct quote. And so we have the example here. Tom said, quote, "It sure is hot." And, quote, "It sure is," unquote, Mary replied. And so you see that each one of those, we go into the quote, Tom said, comma, and then the quote marks, and then the and then what Tom said. In the response, we have the quote, "It sure is," comma, close quotes, Mary replied. And so we use the comma to enter into and leave direct quotes. But not if you have other punctuation. So again, you know, the whole Mary, Tom dialogue here. Scintillating and fascinating, I'm sure. Okay. You want some ice water? He asked. So notice that we have the question mark because he's asking a question, but there's no comma. It's not, you want some ice water, question mark, comma, or comma, question mark. You don't double up on the punctuation. If there's another item of punctuation used inside the quotes, you don't use the comma as well. And this is a general rule. You don't double up on punctuation. And so, you know, Mary responds, quote, "Sure, I'm dying of heat stroke," exclamation point, close quotes. But you don't have a comma there. And so the exclamation point, in a sense, overrules the comma. And so it's not, quote, "Sure, I'm dying of heat stroke," exclamation point, comma, close quotes. Okay, so you don't double up on the punctuation in or out of quotes, but you do use the comma if you don't have other punctuation. You use a comma also when you're addressing somebody directly. And of course, we don't use commas in speech, and that's very often where we are speaking directly to somebody. But when you record that speech, that utterance, you would use a comma to record it. So you would say, "Tom, comma, come in here and do your homework." So that Tom, the name Tom, you're talking to Tom, is set off with a comma. And if the name of the person that you're talking to, that you're addressing, is in the middle of the sentence, again, you'd set it off on both sides as a parenthetical, such as, "I've told you many times, comma, Sally, comma, I've told you many times, Sally, that references in the works cited are alphabetized by the last name of the author." And so you see Sally is set off on both sides with a comma. So if you're addressing somebody directly, you would use a comma to set off their name. So here we get to the seventh and last rule for commas, and so we're almost done, so just hang in there. This you might think of as the miscellaneous category. So you use commas in dates, places, and numbers. And so dates, such as the example that I have, where is it? It's over here. He was born on July 4th, 1900 in a thunderstorm. So he was born on July 4th, comma, 1900, comma. Okay, so also notice sometimes we miss the comma after the year. Okay, after the year we miss the comma, but you have to have the comma there as well. So July 4th, comma, 1900, comma. Okay, we traveled to Akron, comma, Ohio on our vacation. We traveled to Akron, Ohio on our vacation. So the Ohio is set off on both sides as a comma. If you want to, you can think of the Ohio, or the 1900 in this case, as parenthetical elements. They further define, further specify what July 4th or what Akron and what state it is that we're talking about. So if that helps you. So dates and places, and also numbers, and you should be pretty familiar with this. We set it off, we use a comma to set off each thousand. So $4,500 would be 4, comma, 500. The new car from India only costs $4,500 off the showroom floor. So it's a new import from India. They're able to employ less expensive labor and perhaps produce a smaller car, and so it only costs $4,500. Okay. More than 65,000 fans attended the game. So notice we have 65 to represent the thousands, and then the comma, and then the 3 zeros. Okay. American Idol has been viewed by more than 30 million viewers. So 30, comma, 000, comma, and then 000. Okay, so we use commas to divide numbers into groups of thousands as well. So these are the miscellaneous uses of the comma. So we've come to the end of the discussion about commas, and you never thought that commas, those tiny little marks, could be so complicated. Well, they are. Now remember, commas save lives, as we saw. Let's eat grandpa. Okay, so I hope you use a comma there. You aren't suggesting that we actually eat grandpa. And to leave you, we'll take a look at the example above that actually appeared on somebody's resume. And so my hobbies include cooking dogs, shopping, dancing, watching movies, and belly dancing. So the cooking dogs is a little bit problematic. But we're also left confused as to whether this person likes to watch movies and watch belly dancing, or whether it's watching movies and perhaps doing belly dancing. Okay, so anyway, don't leave your reader confused. Use commas correctly, and you'll find them very useful, very helpful in your communication.